So welcome everybody to our regular, almost every Wednesday, Vermont Sierra Club's Community Conversations. Tonight we've got a great one lined up about how much Vermont is or isn't faking it on greenhouse gas emissions. It's a very current topic with the Climate Council, and it will be as we move into the legislative session as well. So it's great to have you all join us tonight. We have a great group of speakers joining us tonight who've been working very closely with this topic with the Climate Council and its subcommittees. You'll see them up there on the screen: Jeffrey Gardner, Bill Bender, Kim Hayden, George Gross, and Stuart Blood, along with myself. We've all been working on this issue pretty closely. So we're excited to bring you this tonight. And the way this is going to work, I guess first I should mention this is all being recorded. We will have some presentations that go on for about a half an hour, and then spend the second half in good discussion. And so we welcome your questions. If you'd like to put your questions in the chat as we go, that'd be great. It's possible our speakers will have a chance to pick up on those as we go, but mostly we'll expect to get to those in the second half. With that, I don't want to spend a lot more time with introductions here. I'm just going to pass it along right away to Jeffrey Gardner, who's going to introduce our session tonight. Jeffrey.
Great. Thank you, Steve. This will be just a very, very quick overview of this topic of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and also what the Vermont Climate Council is doing under that act. Now, in 2018, two important things happened that seem to have penetrated the legislative mind in Vermont. The first was that year's emissions inventory actually showed that Vermont's GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, had actually gone up. And the second was in October of that year, so it's just exactly 3 years ago now, the IPC came out with a report that said it was absolutely essential that over the next 11 or 12 years, by 2030, greenhouse gas emissions had to be limited more severely than people had anticipated before, or we would not stay at the 1.5 level at most, let alone if we didn't, we would be in a race to reach the 2 degrees centigrade level. That would really mean disaster. In response, what the legislature did was say, well, it's about time to get serious about all of this. And they did two things. They passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that act said that, in fact, the goals that had already been in statute in Vermont were now not goals, were not an aspirational matter, but they were requirements. They had to be reached according to actually the same dates that were already also in statute. The second thing they did was develop ideas for creating a climate council made up of 23 members from various places, selected by various bodies. And that climate council was supposed to design a plan that would be available and finished on December 1st of this year. The law passed in 2020. We're looking forward now over the next just 2 months to seeing the plan and seeing how it comes out. So these were the two big changes. There was a climate council. It was going to make a plan, and the goal of the plan was no longer just a goal, but the requirement of the plan was that we reach the goals that were already in statute. And those are two things that didn't change. The goals were already there, for one thing, and also the whole notion of reducing GHG emissions raises the question of counting. And there are two things about counting. One is the question of how you count, which in this case, as in many, can be quite complicated and difficult. And that's not our topic tonight. The other is, what are you going to count? And that's where we get to tonight's topic and where we get to a serious problem area. What was already in law in Vermont was that what needed to be counted were GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, within the boundaries of the state, but also those that occurred outside the boundaries of the state, but were caused by use of energy within Vermont. That was also refined further by another part of the law, which began to name the various kinds of energy and their sources that had to be considered in tracking emissions. There was an amendment to that law. Actually, that was on the books from 2007. It was already there. In 2011, that was amended to say that in tracking out-of-state emissions, life cycle considerations have to be taken account of. And that included not only fossil fuels, which emit CO2, methane, and so on, but it also included biomass used for burning to generate electricity. Now, the thing about those two bits of the law is that they never were actually implemented. For the most part, with one minor exception, the state of Vermont has only tracked, only accounted for, only inventoried those emissions that occur within the boundaries of the state. And that is a huge issue for these reasons. First of all, Vermont is a state that imports nearly all of its electricity. There's relatively little electricity that is generated in Vermont. Most of the electricity that's used in Vermont is the result either of hydroelectric dams, Hydro-Quebec in Canada, which are methane emitters, and also greenhouse methane emissions that are the result of burning gas. VGS supplies gas that people use to heat their homes, cook, heat their hot water, and so forth. And that methane comes from out of the state. It leaks like mad during transport, storage, and even venting, and that's not counted in our emissions either. So the three things that aren't counted are methane emissions from Hydro-Quebec, biomass used to generate electricity, burned to generate electricity, and methane emissions associated with VGS's supply and transport of gas into the state. Now, beginning in 2017, the state began using a renewable energy standard, and that standard named certain forms of energy, included the ones I just mentioned, as being renewable, but they were also not counted in the inventory because, for various reasons with each of them, something we'll get into in a while, they were all considered to be zero emissions. So here we are in a situation where the emissions produced by burning biomass for gas, the methane that comes and is emitted by the hydroelectric dams in Canada, the methane that's burned to generate electricity outside the state for use in the state, these are things that are not counted in the inventory. And what this comes down to is that in the latest inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, electricity counts for only 5.7% of the total of emissions generated as a result of energy that's used in Vermont. And I think it's obvious that that's way, way far from what the actual situation is. And that has an effect on the policy that's set in Vermont relative to energy use and GHG emissions, and also specifically about electricity and natural gas. And those things have consequences too. So far, the Vermont Climate Council, although they've changed their attitude toward this problem slightly, they have done nothing that will alter this situation. And this has pretty serious consequences in terms of the things that will be selected to be the things that are focused on by the Climate Action Plan. And probably they will lead to emissions that are neither as extensive nor as rapid as they should be. And that will be the subject of the things that my friends here will have to say soon and in more detail.
There, I have to unmute myself. Thanks, Jeffrey, for that great introduction. With that, we're going to roll right into having a hearing from Bill Bender and Kim Hayden about one of the real crucial and tough topics to figure out, and that is the concept of additionality. Additionality is a core concept for all of this stuff. So, Bill, we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve. So the question here is Vermont's electricity green? So it depends upon who you ask. If you talk to Google or Apple, Greenie, or even the other New England states, they will say that no, Vermont's electricity really is not green. It's only the Vermont utilities and some of the Vermont bureaucracy that says, yes, Vermont electricity is green. So let's look a little more carefully here. So Google, they have the concept of additionality, and this is a global concept. And the basic concept of additionality is that you have to do things that are new in order to reduce greenhouse gases. So Google says we will only purchase energy from newly constructed generation facilities. Apple says they prioritize the creation of new renewable energy projects. Greenie, which is the largest certifier of renewable energy in the US, says their energy has to be from new projects built within 15 years in order to certify it. Other New England states recognize, in ISO New England, the New England Grid, recognize that Vermont is unique because Vermont is the only state in New England that will recognize existing 20th century hydro power as renewable. So who says electricity is green? Well, Vermont does. And the Vermont utilities do. The Department of Public Service and the Public Utilities Commission and their policies are effectively saying, hey, we're good. So there's an example of this. This is data that was presented to the Vermont Climate Council by the state. And if you look here, and Stuart will go into this data a little bit more a little bit later, but the point is from 2016 to 2018, they show a major reduction in carbon emissions in the electric sector. And the numbers actually show a reduction of 620,000 metric tons of carbon in just 2 years. Well, what would that mean? It would mean we built in those 2 years 5 times more solar than ever was built before in Vermont, or we took a third of the cars in Vermont and threw them all into Lake Champlain. So clearly neither of those things happened. This was totally a paper change in the situation according to Vermont. Now let's look at the largest utility in Vermont, which covers about 3/4 of Vermont. This is from their website, and it's actually a little bit old because now they say it's 100% carbon free. And 63% renewable. And they have these really nice pictures of wind and solar. And isn't that fantastic? What a good job we're doing. Well, if you look more detail in their website, you'll see 2.2% of their energy supply is solar and 0.0% is wind. So the point is 20th century and 19th century dams and nuclear plants, which is what is being used, what is actually there, not the wind and the nuclear or the wind and the solar. They do not reduce emissions. You need to build new things to reduce emissions. And I'll turn this over to Kim, who'll have some more detailed information on this.
Thanks, Bill. And I do have a slide deck that'll be available after the session, and it may be available during if there are questions. I've prepared one, but we don't have a lot of time. I'll just talk quickly about the Global Warming Solutions Act and the fundamental requirements that are tied to the Paris Agreement, which in turn require this concept of it's really a protocol, a fundamental protocol prerequisite of additionality that is required for any mitigation to actually result in reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So through the Global Warming Solutions Act, Vermont amended in 2020 10 VSA section 578, which requires that Vermont shall reduce our emissions. And Steve spoke to this earlier. These are the same emission levels that we had targeted earlier, but they're very aggressive. By 2025 and 2030, up to 40% of our prior emissions levels. And it specifically requires that we do this in accordance with the policies to achieve the objectives of the 2016 Paris Agreement. So that now the connection to the Paris Agreement is now law in Vermont, as are the mandates. The Paris Agreement section 4.13 requires that in meeting our nationally determined contributions, which is a term of art that's used for the mitigation mechanisms that we've committed to as a nation, and Vermont as a state has committed to, that we promote environmental integrity, transparency, and accuracy in accordance with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the UNFCCC, the very first treaty on climate change, which was executed in 1994, followed by the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And it was really through the Kyoto Protocol that mechanisms were addressed to require this precondition of having additionality in mitigation that would actually result in reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. The Paris Agreement, Section 6.4, requires that climate mitigation mechanisms must deliver an overall mitigation in global emissions. That is, they must achieve reductions. The UNFCCC requires mitigation projects and offsets, like the kind of offsets Bill was alluding to, and what I'm referring to here are carbon offsets, Hydro-Quebec offsets that are being procured by Vermont utilities in massive amounts, that they demonstrate additionality. And what you'll hear from later, and I believe Stuart will speak to this in more detail, is that what we're doing in Vermont is we're actually acquiring unbundled, what are called attributes from Hydro-Quebec, as well as bundled with energy, energy plus these attributes, and we're acquiring them in massive amounts, millions of megawatt hours a year. And that's what is making up our electricity portfolio. It is permitted under the renewable energy standard that Jeffrey spoke to, this law that talks about, our renewable energy requirements. The fundamental issue, though, is that it's no longer legal and under the Global Warming Solutions Act to just address our electricity requirements through these carbon offsets that no longer and actually never did meet the requirements of the United Nations framework and the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Paris Agreement, which fundamentally require additionality and real transparent mechanisms that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'm happy to take questions later, but I want to, in terms of time, move it on to others.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill and Kim. So I should mention as we go, if you have questions, please feel free to pop those into the chat box, and we'll get to them now or later in the second half of our hour. So now we want to turn to George Gross, who's going to address this whole question of life cycle accounting that Jeffrey introduced a few minutes ago. George.
Cool. Okay. I'll just take a minute to introduce myself. I have been a member of the Sierra Club since the mid-90s, but haven't been really politically active with Sierra Club until December last year, where I linked up with Steve and others in this group to kind of watchdog the Climate Council. Back in the day when I was, previous to my retirement, I was a computer scientist at Bell Laboratories. And so I kind of come at things with a technical and scientific perspective. And obviously, key goal here is to take these complicated topics we've got in front of us and make them accessible to anyone and everyone here. So feel free to interject with your questions if, in fact, you see something you don't quite get your head around. Steve, can you go to the next slide, please? So I first want to introduce a concept that we've kind of talked around, but really haven't brought into focus. And that's the concept of direct versus indirect greenhouse gas emissions. No doubt some of you have heard of this, the concept of a carbon footprint. In fact, your carbon footprint is sort of this plume of greenhouse gases that your lifestyle leaves behind you every day that you do the things we normally take for granted that happen to emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. What you may not have been aware of was the magnitude of them. When you look at your lifestyle, fully 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions caused by your lifestyle actually are not really visible. They're embedded in the products and foods and services that we purchase every day. And it's because the greenhouse gas emissions were done somewhere else on the planet, not on your doorstep, in your car, or in your furnace. They're invisible, out of sight, out of mind. And it turns out they add up quite a bit. There have been academic studies that show that somewhere on the order of 15 to 25 metric tons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions are emitted by each household in America, with the larger households emitting as much as upwards of 100 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So although that's a major part of the puzzle that hasn't been really addressed by the Climate Action Plan, I did want to bring people's attention to it, because I think in the future, it's going to become increasingly obvious that this part of the problem really needs to have as much focus as the 40% is being addressed by the Climate Action Plan. Steve, could you go to the next slide? So this slide takes a look at the greenhouse gas emissions of Vermont and kind of characterizes them through the lens of direct and embedded greenhouse gas emissions. I use the term embedded greenhouse gas emissions and life cycle emissions kind of interchangeably here. However, it probably needs a little bit of clarification. Typically, embedded greenhouse gas emissions refer to the emissions embedded in a product or service that you're speaking about, whether it's the desk that's in front of you, or perhaps the manufacturing that went into a product that has plastic and steel and aluminum in it, like a car, or the house that was built for you. All the materials all have embedded emissions. Whereas direct emissions, they're typically the electricity that you use, the space heating that's keeping your house warm or cooling your house in the summer, and the transportation fuels you use to propel your car or your truck. So those are the four primary sources of our greenhouse gas emissions if you look around. And the ones shown in orange here are the embedded or indirect emissions, also known as life cycle emissions. When I say life cycle, what it means basically, there are different ways to draw the system boundary, but generally speaking, for energy products, we're speaking about the emissions that occurred all the way from the wellhead where the fuel was extracted from the earth, all the way through to your doorstep where it goes into the tank of your car, and then through the engine and out the tailpipe. And then subsequently, if there was any disposal of that, that would also be part of the life cycle emissions. But right now, we don't dispose of our carbon dioxide emissions in any reasonable way. We just put it into the atmosphere. Whereas other waste products like our cardboard or our compost, we do dispose of responsibly. In this graph, you can see that the majority of our emissions are those embedded emissions, and yet the blue emissions, the direct greenhouse gas emissions, are the only emissions in scope of the Climate Action Plan being carried out by the Vermont Climate Council. Steve, go to the next slide. So the Climate Action Plan actually is trying to turn our energy usage towards using electricity for almost all varieties of direct energy use that we have today. So when you do that, it makes sense to check out what's the grid actually doing as far as going towards near zero emissions. As it turns out, the ISO New England grid, the Independent System Operators New England grid, is not as green as one would hope, certainly not as green as Vermont would have you believe our electricity is. Now, in the worldview of the utilities in Vermont, and for that matter, the Department of Public Service, you can use power purchases to buy electricity in wholesale deals with other vendors, whether it be Hydro Quebec or say a power plant that's fueled by biomass, and treat those as zero emission sources and get your electricity looking really green. But it's not really an authentic green. If you really look at what you're getting in the wall socket, you're getting a pile of electrons that are coming from the same old grid, never mind the legal devices that the utilities are talking about. And so in this graph, our chart here, you see some of the major emitters of greenhouse gases in the ISO New England grid. Certainly the largest you'll see at the bottom there, the gas-fired power plants generate about 40% of the grid's annual electricity. And this bar chart shows not only the direct emissions, which aren't being counted here, but the upstream emissions, which are significant for the fossil gas that's being used to power and generate electricity in the grid. Biomass is also another source of energy for some of the power plants, more so in Vermont than in the grid, New England grid at large. And yet its emissions burning are considered carbon neutral, which is, I think, disputable, to say the least. But even if you didn't do that, you still have things upstream of that biomass. The forest that was cleared to get that firewood is losing its carbon sequestration capability for the duration of time it takes to grow back. And even if it does grow back, it will grow back as a damaged forest, not a healthy, fully functional forest that you started with. So land use of biomass and bioenergy in general is a major part of the life cycle emission studies that one has to take into account. And in fact, because of that, my own perspective is bioenergy is not a carbon neutral energy source, and we should avoid it wherever possible. I don't have any other slides. I guess I'll pass the baton off to whoever's next, unless there's questions.
Okay, well, thanks, George. As I said, we'll throw questions in the chat and make sure you do that, and we will come back to them. Right now, I want to pass it along to Stuart Blood, who's going to address a couple of issues about, what are those important missing greenhouse gas groups and some of the clever accounting that goes on with that. Stuart.
Here we go. Okay. So I am Stuart Blood. I live in Thetford Center. I'm a retired software engineer. Just coincidentally, I did some work for Bill Binder's company several years ago, Solaflect Energy in Norwich. And I'll just leave my introduction with that. Okay, so this first slide I'm showing is a graph that probably most of you are familiar with. It's just a graph of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. Couple of takeaways from this. You can see the red triangle, the two yellow dots. Those are the mandatory targets that Vermont must meet by 2025, 2030, and 2050. Two takeaways: we're a long way from hitting those targets, and we're not, as the other presenters mentioned earlier, we are not even counting all of our emissions. I want to just say something very briefly about global methane emissions. Methane is essentially the main component of natural gas, but there are other sources, non-fossil sources. Methane accounts for historically about a third of all the warming is due to methane emissions from human activity. Couple of notable features that probably most of you know is that methane, when released into the atmosphere unburned, is a much stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. In the short term, it's 86 times more potent than CO2 in the first 20 years. On the upside, it breaks down relatively rapidly in the atmosphere with a half-life of about 12 years. So the good news is that reducing methane emissions as quickly as possible can have a very beneficial effect on limiting future warming. Fossil fuel extraction accounts for, fossil fuel use accounts for, let me get rid of that, about a third of methane emissions due to human activity. We can reduce those emissions, but we have to acknowledge them and account for them. And as other presenters have already said, we are not accounting for methane emissions in the transportation and electric sectors. This has been pretty much covered. Natural gas is a source of methane emissions that escape into the air because of fracking, because of leaks in transmission lines and storage systems from out of state. And there's intentional venting along the way. A couple of presenters have mentioned that Hydro-Quebec electricity generation is responsible for methane releases. And there were a couple of questions in the chat about that. So we can maybe get into this a little bit more during question and answer. But essentially, what happens is that when in Quebec, where massive areas of forest have been flooded behind these mega dams, excuse me, the forests are basically covered, flooded. They decompose anaerobically, and methane is generated during that decomposition, and it's released over time. It's released more in the first year or two, but that release in the first year or two is very substantial, and it continues to release over the years. The final source of methane emissions to mention is other fossil fuels, gasoline for transportation, diesel, heating oil that are produced via fracking or mined via fracking. See, Jeffrey mentioned biomass emissions. I'll just tear through this. The Vermont greenhouse gas emissions inventory tells us that biomass, burning biomass, including whole trees, to generate electricity, as is done in Vermont, is counted, quote, as zero CO2 emissions because the CO2 is of biogenic origin. Notable in response to that is that leaving forests to grow without logging them is really the only tried and true method that we have for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Forests can be cut to generate electricity, and they may eventually grow back, but it's going to take many decades for the new trees to sequester carbon at the same level as that cut forest. And right now, we don't have decades to respond. Okay, here's an example of why our greenhouse gas inventory matters. These data were shown by Bill Bender just a few minutes ago. Here's another presentation, which is notable because it was presented to one of the subcommittees of the Vermont Climate Council by the commissioner of the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. It shows the same numbers where roughly 610 to 620,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions were cut between the years 2016 and 2018. And what's significant about this is that the Commissioner Walk has concluded from this chart. You'll see if you look at the row marked power, which is the electric sector, if you look in the reduction, the last three columns, you'll see that the reductions planned for 2025 and 2030 are negative numbers, which means that they will, the inference there is that they will be increased over the next 9 years. And that hardly squares with a strategy of electrifying the state's transportation and thermal sectors. I'm questioning in this slide, just as Bill Bender did in his slides, how could that be? I mean, how could that emissions reduction be real? I'm afraid my computer is advancing for me. The thing, Steve, how am I doing time-wise? I'll just keep going. Thing to keep in mind here, as a couple of the presenters have already mentioned, renewable is not the same as zero emission. We've already talked about Hydro-Quebec. I won't belabor that. It's treated as zero emissions, but it's not. No other New England state, as Bill said, gives Hydro-Quebec electricity renewable status. Hydro-Quebec environmental attributes aren't even allowed to be called renewable energy certificates or credits by others in other states. Vermont counts Hydro-Quebec electricity as renewable and zero emission. So I just mentioned renewable energy credits. Let me read the definition used by the US Energy Information Agency. RECs are financial products available for sale, purchase, or trade that allow a purchaser to pay for renewable energy production without directly obtaining the energy from renewable energy sources. So what does that mean? It means that a utility can buy a REC. If it's an electric utility, a REC is 1 megawatt hour of energy, can buy that without buying the actual energy. That purchased REC or environmental attribute allows the utility to claim some of the energy it sells as renewable, even though that energy is not necessarily produced renewably, let alone with zero greenhouse gas emissions. Those RECs can be unbundled from the energy, sold separately from the energy, and they, in Vermont, can count toward compliance of Vermont's renewable energy standard. And as Kim mentioned a few minutes ago, Green Mountain Power is buying up unbundled Hydro-Quebec attributes and applying them as compliance for their renewable energy standard requirements. So no other New England states allow Hydro-Quebec attributes to be used for their state's renewable energy standard compliance, but Vermont does. Therefore, Hydro-Quebec attributes have a much lower market value because remember, these are traded on the market among utilities. So Hydro-Quebec attributes have a much lower market value than the RECs that Green Mountain Power generates, for example, at its Lowell wind farm. Okay, I am not going to go into any detail about this, other than to say this is a slide that was presented by the Department of Public Service to the Vermont legislature earlier this year. It shows that Green Mountain Power sells its RECs to out-of-state utilities. So GMP gets its RECs from its Lowell wind farm and it sells them to out-of-state utilities who then apply those RECs to their own state's renewable energy standards requirements. And then GMP buys Hydro-Quebec attributes to replace those sold RECs, and they apply those non-renewable attributes to comply with Vermont's renewable energy standard. Okay, so who's benefiting from this deception? In 2018, GMP sold RECs on average for $23. And then they replaced those RECs with Hydro-Quebec attributes that no other state would accept, but they only paid 50 cents for those. And they realized a net gain, Green Mountain Power, from this REC arbitrage realized a net gain of $3.6 million. So back to the question that Bill raised originally, where did that 610 to 620,000 metric tons of reduction come from? Well, here's another slide from the Department of Public Service to the legislature. And, you can see it in that circled spot. That's the same number. And it's explained in this slide, but let me summarize it here in this slide to make it a little bit easier. That 610,000 plus tons is the same figure that the ANR claims in their presentation to the Vermont Climate Council as a reduction in the electric sector. Furthermore, implying that the 2050 target is already met so that emissions in that sector can increase. And yet 74% of that reduction is attributed in this slide, back there, I won't bother to find it, is attributed to these Hydro-Quebec attributes. So finally, I'm just gonna leave with this question. Why do we even have a renewable energy standard in Vermont? If renewable doesn't mean zero greenhouse gas emissions, how is this renewable energy standard helping us to meet the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act? How does it reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And isn't what we really need an emissions reduction standard?
Okay, thanks, Stuart. These are not super simple concepts, but they seem to show up over and over again. So we're last going to go to Bill Bender, who's going to give us an idea of some of the where this shows up in our opportunities for compliance with the Global Warming Solutions Act. Bill.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Oh, and Bill, if 1 second, again, folks, throw your questions in the chat. We're running a little late, so we will, extend our close time to make sure we get some good time for discussion. So, Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So this is going to synthesize what pretty much everyone has been saying so far and sort of take the next step of okay, so now what? So there is just absolutely huge momentum in the climate system. And this is the graph of the Mauna Loa carbon dioxide measurements to show that it's not only been growing, but it's growing at an accelerating rate. And even if we stopped all emissions today, the climate, there's a lot of momentum in the climate. So anytime you have a system like that with a lot of momentum in it, anything you do today is far more valuable than anything you do 5 years or 10 years or 20 years in the future. So if we really want to affect the climate trajectory over the next century, we really have to focus on what do we do immediately. And so a little bit of background to get to that. So where does New England power come from? So and Vermont is largely nuclear and hydropower. So nuclear is a fixed output. It runs at full capacity virtually all the time, except for when it's shut down to refuel. Hydropower on an annual basis is essentially the same thing. If there's rain, they're going to use that rain and produce power. They're not going to just throw that money away when they could run it through the turbines. So they want to use all the water that's in those dams to generate power. And that's what they try to do. There's a little bit of resource there in terms of balancing loads by time of day and when you do that. But the total amount of power is essentially fixed. The same is true with renewables, wind and solar. It's dependent, it's variable, it's dependent on weather, but virtually 100% of that is produced when it can be produced. There's very little curtailment of these resources to date in northeastern US, except for utility-built wind, oddly enough. So what's the balancing resource? The balancing resource is almost always natural gas. 43% of New England's electricity is natural gas, and virtually all of the balancing of the power grid is done with natural gas. So if we look at Vermont, We have consumed our retail sales in Vermont, 5.4 terawatts. This is 2019 data from the US government instead of from the state. The imports into the state are nearly 60%. Hydro and nuclear is almost all this. So solar here and wind are less than 10% of the electricity that's actually produced and used in the state. So what happens at the margin? That's the economist in me that thinks this way. So if you turn on a switch or you turn off a light switch, what happens? What happens is natural gas has to go up or down. That's the balancing resource we have. The nuclear plant is not going to turn up or down. The hydro is not going to turn up or down, and neither is the wind or the solar. What's going to turn up and down is natural gas. So if you add a new EV, and we say electrify, 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 that is the solution. But how we do that matters a lot in how we affect the climate. So if we add an EV, what happens to CO2? Well, if you just compare it to a gasoline engine, you'd say it saves about 60% of that carbon emissions if that electricity is produced by a really efficient natural gas plant. And that's what it will be produced. If we add a whole bunch of EVs, where's that power come from today? It has to come from natural gas. In the long term, it can come from something else. In the short term, it's natural gas. Well, as we heard earlier, it depends upon the fugitive emissions. The official number is about 1.4% of natural gas is lost in fugitive emissions. Stuart mentioned that there's about 85 times short 20-year global warming potential to that. A lot of academics say that the fugitive emissions are actually double the official numbers. If it's only 1.74%, those fugitive emissions, then the EV, or if it's above that, the EV is actually worse than the gasoline engine if you just produce the EV and you don't add some kind of renewable. Now, if you at the same time, you add solar and an EV, well, then you reduce the CO2 because now you're directly reducing the CO2 from the gasoline, and the battery capacity of the car significantly increases the amount of renewables that you can add to the grid. Same with a heat pump. A heat pump is kind of neutral unless at the same time you have some additionality and you're building new renewables to provide the power. Unfortunately, heat pumps and solar don't match very well, so it really is dependent upon building wind. But there's not a lot of wind going in right now. Until we have offshore winds, heat pumps are probably about neutral. They don't actually do a lot for us. But what does do a lot for us today is solar. If you put in solar, you're turning off natural gas. You're not turning down nuclear, you're not turning down hydro, you're not turning down existing wind and solar, you're turning down gas. So what is not a solution today? Well, Vermont wind, new wind is essentially dead. Offshore wind, that's going to be great. And a lot of the Vermont Department of Public Service talks a lot about offshore wind. Great. Cape Wind was first reported in the Boston Globe in 2006. They terminated their lease rights in 2017. 15 years later, where's Cape Wind? So that'll be great when it happens, but it's not happening very fast, and it's not happening today. Hydropower, there's very little room for more hydropower. There's a little bit more room in Quebec, but 80% of everything from Hydro-Quebec is 20th century. And the new dams that are potential there have very high methane emissions, and so it's a questionable benefit. More nuclear, well, some people think that would be a great long-term solution, but it's certainly at least a decade out, and in the Northeast, I think it's dead. So what can you actually do today? Well, the one thing that we can actually do today that's cost effective is solar. Solar, and more solar. Even the Vermont Department of Public Service, there's a minimal rate impact on electricity rates. There's no fiscal impact on the state budget. And the big thing is when Vermonters own solar, they also upgrade their home electrical system. They monitor their energy usage. They conserve energy. They electrify other things faster than non-solar owners, and they become climate change evangelists. And that is huge. It's just like we support home ownership for a reason, because we think it's more beneficial when people own homes. It's the same with solar. We should support solar ownership. Community solar, we can learn from other states. A lot of other states have community solar with specific low-income carve-outs. We don't have that in Vermont. Low-income weatherization, that is probably one of the best things we can do for low-income Vermonters. Immediately reduces carbon emissions. unfortunately, potentially has some large fiscal impacts. So how we do that it matters a lot from a budget perspective. EV charging stations are absolutely critical to EV adoption. We have more EVs, it allows more renewable penetration because the batteries that come with EVs automatically allow a much greater penetration of EVs. The Ford electric truck that has recently been announced is going to provide 3 to 4 days of electricity consumption for an average Vermont household, and it could provide weeks or months really. And if you have solar, you could provide unlimited emergency power. So what are the barriers? The barriers right now to really affecting climate change are unfortunately are self-created within the state. We have to change state policy so that we can improve the climate today. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Bill. What a great wrap up for this. So, folks, we're open for questions here. Scanning down the list, the one question that really jumped out at me was the question from John Bartholomew about methane from hydro, and I think that that may have been addressed as we went along. Did you hear that addressed there, John?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's something that was not recognized as much for a long time, but more recent research has shown that the methane from hydro is pretty big, especially as they raise and lower the reservoir levels. That region in the margin of the reservoirs tends to emit a lot more methane. Unfortunately, that's exactly how they're looking at using those reservoirs as a kind of a storage battery for the Northeast with much more ups and downs. But that's, I'm not seeing other questions. Am I missing any more questions in the chat? Go ahead and Tony Reddington asked. Tony, do you want to voice that question?
Sure. Question is, I saw that the Public Utilities Commission and the Public Utilities Department, which I worked for a couple of years, were named as barriers to the climate change goals. But I also worked 15 years for the Agency of Transportation, and I never viewed them as proactive in climate change areas. Do you see the Vermont Agency of Transportation as a positive force?
I personally don't have an answer for that. I think, I wonder if, I couldn't say Rob, I'd turn to Rob Kidd for that because he's had more direct involvement with transportation issues, including with those folks. Did you hear the question, Rob?
Yes, I did. And I'm going to answer it and say yes and no. Basically, the Vermont Agency of Transportation is doing a lot of really good projects to move the envelope, but I'm going to give credit to the legislature pushing the Agency of Transportation. A lot of the Agency of Transportation folks are engineer-based, and they're all thinking the old ways of roads and bridges and not to how we transport people. But like I said, there's some good people doing some studies, like Ross McDonald, who we had on here about the My Ride program. He's doing a study on electrifying buses right now. So there are good programs going on. I'm just going to say, give credit to the legislators who push them.
More questions? If anybody has a question, just raise your hand or put it into chat. I will say while we're waiting, this is a topic that was met with some skepticism or was largely ignored as the Climate Council started its work. But I think some advocacy and education there has made a big difference. And there are quite a few people on the Climate Council or its subcommittees who are also sharing these questions about biomass, about greenhouse gas from hydro and fugitive methane, and especially that upstream, the challenge of life cycle accounting in the upstream energy pipeline. So we're making progress. those kinds of things get undone really quickly though. So we're hanging on and would love to have other input. Stuart, I think I see your hand up first and then we go to Richard.
Yeah, I had a question that I thought that maybe Kim Hayden could maybe address, and that is with the REC arbitrage that GMP is engaged in with the Hydro-Quebec attributes, and in 2018 they made a profit or a gain at least of $3.6 million. I've heard it argued that that is what keeps Green Mountain Power's rates low, but I haven't heard any affirmation of that. I'm wondering, is it true, or what happens? Where does that $3.6 million go? Does it go into the pockets of the investors, or does it really reduce rates?
Well, I've only participated in, on behalf of Renewable Energy Vermont, one of the Green Mountain Power rate cases. And by the way, it's not just Green Mountain Power. This is REC arbitrage is something that essentially the legislature allowed all of the utilities to engage in when it passed the renewable energy standard, and allowed not attributes from Hydro-Quebec, from New York Power Authority, NYPA, very old hydro resources coming from New York, from the Niagara Mohawk Power Supply Authority, and other resources that are considered to be Class 2 RECs. All of our utilities are engaging in this REC arbitrage. They're selling virtually all of the in-state good stuff out of state. Almost all of the solar, almost all of the good wind is being sold. The attributes, the RECs, are sold out of state and replaced with Class 2 or even non-REC resources, as Stuart, as you were mentioning before, Stuart, because Hydro-Quebec is not a REC. Hydro-Quebec is not recognized as having REC attributes. They don't qualify as RECs. But back to your question, my understanding is that they do offset their cost of service. But at the end of the day, so the cost of service, they're not going up as direct profits to the shareholder, which is Engineer, I guess now no longer Gas Metro. It's an out-of-state Canadian conglomerate. So the profits don't go directly, but indirectly, they go to the shareholders of Green Mountain Power, and then for the other utilities, Green Mountain Power is an investor-owned utility, so it goes directly to its shareholder investor, which is Engineer and its shareholders. But there is some offsetting that happens. It's complicated, but it's really not in a way. We should not be allowing the utilities in Vermont, and we shouldn't put up with it to have the utilities basically greenwashing what is natural gas, fossil fuel resources in our electricity mix. We think we are consuming green electricity in the state. People are buying electric vehicles, putting in air source heat pumps, trying to do things because they care. And yet a huge portion of our electricity portfolio has methane, has other, has CO2 emissions, and it's being washed over by these attributes that don't do anything, that are non-conforming with the Paris Accord. Non-conforming is not a strong enough word. We're violating the fundamental principles of the Paris Accord and the United Nations Framework Convention by allowing this kind of accounting to occur. And in the green state of Vermont, we just shouldn't be putting up with it.
Thanks, Kim. Richard, to you. Welcome.
Oops, thank you. So this is all very disturbing. I was involved in the Bristol Community Solar Project, and certainly became aware of the fact that it's a very tangled kind of business. We found it hard to sell because the solar adder now is down to a penny and is going to disappear, as you all know. And when people costed out whether it made sense to invest their $700 per unit in stock market or in solar, the stock market would probably overperform. So they had to be really dedicated to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, which thankfully some were. But one of the things I wanted to ask the panel, at an energy committee meeting, Chris Bray was talking about a bill that is before his committee, I guess known as electricity at scale. And I got the sense that that was going to be an emphasis rather than supporting community solar. And I wondered how the panel feels about that.
Richard, just let me check on your question there. Would he have been talking about weatherization at scale?
No, he was talking about, no, it wasn't weatherization. Basically what he was saying is there's going to be a drive. He would like to see a drive to increase the scale of solar projects and concentrate on that. His rationale was that if the larger scale projects, which are more efficient and have a higher payback, are added to the grid, the electricity rate will go down for all Vermonters versus community solar where people are getting the direct benefit by investing, becoming investors. My concern with that was really the not in my backyard problem with large scale. And people are much less apt, I think, to buy in to something like that than to something that's in their own town and benefit them directly.
Kim?
And I've communicated with Senator Bray about this before, and this has been coming up for the last two legislative sessions. So it's really an alternative to net metering is what he's talking about, yes. I think. And yeah. I think it's pretty transparent that that's what he's speaking about. I presented last week at the Public Utility Commission. There's a slide deck which I'll provide to Sierra Club so they can post it as well. Over the past, from 2014 to 2020, Vermont's electric rates were among the lowest in New England. The only other state that was higher or lower was Maine. And through that period, our rates remained flat. I mean, literally, there was through the net metering increases that we've heard about over the years between 2014, 15, in particular, 16, 17, our rates have stayed level. And that's one of the last slides in this presentation, which again, I'll provide to the Sierra Club. So that to me reflects the fact that net metering has a de minimis impact on rates. There's never been empirical data to support an adverse impact on rates. Vermont is the only state, I believe, in New England that does not have retail choice, which means in the other states in New England and in New York, customers can choose the provider of their electricity. In Vermont, we have monopoly service. It's called integrated retail service. But our utilities have a franchise and they're the only retail provider for customers. The exception in Vermont and other states like Vermont, which there are only a few, Minnesota, is net metering. So if you want to have clean energy and really clean energy that you say is actually green in Vermont, the only option is net metering. So I think respectfully, I think Senator Bray has been influenced by the utilities with this and the department, but there's never been any empirical data to support a rate impact, a rate shift. And in fact, I think the data, again, that I cited at the end of my presentation, which I'll provide to the Sierra Club, just illustrates the opposite. Our rates have remained low. I don't think it's just from rec arbitrage. I think our rates have been lower than other New England states, largely because we have not pursued aggressive renewable energy programs in the state of Vermont. I mean, we've been very modest in our programs, notwithstanding what the rhetoric that is out there.
Hey, I want to go to Jean, but George or any of the other panelists, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the turning off the lights on net metering has a direct consequence that the rate payers will be paying for solar built by Green Mountain Power, and the shareholders will be getting all the dividends paid for investing in solar at large scale to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars over the life of those solar arrays. Consider for a moment that the Climate Council is currently speaking about on the order of 1,000 to 2,000 megawatts capacity of solar, and that's going to probably be tilted towards utility-based and utility-owned infrastructure that goes into the rate base and gets 9% return on equity. So for the life of that array, which might be 30 to 50 years, the shareholders will get dividend payments on it, plus the tax credits, plus accelerated depreciation benefits against their taxes on their dividends. So it's a real sweet deal for the utilities to build the solar instead of letting other people do it. In contrast, obviously, community solar has been kept deliberately small, so the getting started cost is a very large fraction of the cost per peak watt that you actually had deployed. If you were actually able to do a utility scale community solar array, you would get the same economies of scale that the utilities already enjoy. And with a commensurate decrease in cost, it would go down to less than $2 a peak watt. But once you've done that, utilities get pretty annoyed with this because they're not making as much money. So it's as simple as that.
Yeah, thanks. Jeffrey, I think you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just want to
Bill
put
as well.
a point on what George just said, and it goes to what Kim said too. And that is, there's a definite move to cut net metering, to limit, if not completely get rid of, community solar in the state. And it isn't just the utilities, it's the utilities and those three, especially PUC and DPS, but also ANR. It's those three agencies that I must say had been captured not only by GMP, but GMP is in the lead. What GMP wants, they do. And I think the whole point of limiting net metering, limiting community solar, is to clear the field of independent operators, to clear the field of people who control their own utility and their own electricity supply, and open that field instead to big developments and the utilities. And that is dirty pool as far as I'm concerned.
Bill.
Yeah, it really comes down to consumer choice. And the reality is Vermont consumers want some control of their solar. And it's the same as the difference between, do people want to own their own house or their own condo when they can, or do people want to live in a 1,000-person condo block that is state built and state sanctioned? And if we want to look at how do we solve the climate issue, we're going to have to engage people. And we have to, if we're going to electrify, if we're going to get electric lawnmowers and electric weed whackers or whatever, people have to be engaged. And when people own their own solar, they're engaged in a 10, 100, 1,000 time way than when it just comes and they turn on a light and turn it off. And we see that every single day with our customers. Once they get solar, they watch it on the app, they see what's happening, they start thinking about, oh, well, what would happen if, what happens when I get my electric car? What happens if I get a heat pump? What happens if I upgrade my panel and I add a smart panel that I can control and I can turn circuits on and off? That's what it's going to take, that kind of participation by all Vermont consumers. And the best way to engage the consumers is when they have a stake, whether it's solar in their house, or if it's community solar for people that rent, or it's community solar with low-income carve-outs for people that, a lot of states are way ahead of Vermont in terms of community solar with low-income carve-outs that are specifically addressing getting solar to everyone. That's what's going to solve the climate crisis, when individuals get engaged, and that's how we do it.
And hopefully that will be something that we can convince the Climate Council is an essential part of their plan. We will see. Stuart has placed a good description in the chat of the relationship between our regulatory agencies and our utilities, which is worth taking a look at. But I want to go to Gene Krause, who has had his hand up for a while. Gene.
Hi, I also want to point out that the Climate Council has a whole subcommittee that's relating to BIPOC and justice being delivered during the transition. It is clear that mega dams such as that in Quebec disproportionately impact Native people's lands and lives. And so that not only are we receiving non-green energy, we are doing it at the expense of non-white people and communities.
Well said. Certainly true. It is it's something that the Just Transition subcommittee that you referred to has actually been somewhat reluctant to pick up. They have kind of expressed to me a belief that, well, that's outside of our borders and we don't really have control over that. But of course, you know, I have pointed out to them that, well, that's almost defines environmental justice, right? You create impacts on far away, so you don't have to look at them, but they end up in somebody else's backyard, and they are trying to address the concept of environmental justice. I don't know how they put those two things together, but there are individuals there who are bringing it up, and the more it's brought up, the more likely it is to be heard. Did you still have your hand up? Did you want to respond?
Well,
say any more, Gene?
More people who respond and provide input to the Climate Council as it puts the plan together, the more we support those people in the Just Transition group. And so I would urge anybody and everybody, if you haven't, to make a comment related to justice for the indigenous people impacted by hydropower. Leave off where it's from.
Yeah, I'm looking at their calendar right now to see when their next meeting is. But the Just Transitions Committee takes public comment at every meeting. So they don't seem to have one listed on their calendar. So I think they're still meeting. But anybody else want to add to that topic? Jeffrey.
Just the other day in the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee, Judy Dow, who's an Abenaki woman, spoke up on exactly this point and spoke passionately, although quietly, and was persuasive, so that a number of the committee members came forward in support of what she said. And I do believe that limiting, if not eliminating in the long run, electricity from Hydro-Quebec is one of their suggestions on the basis of that criticism, as well as the fact that obviously there are members of that committee who don't like to see forests drowned.
Yes. Yeah. So the more opportunities. They are holding a public listening session. I think it's tomorrow night, if I'm not mistaken. A virtual public engagement event online tomorrow night. So, and there'll be another one on the 5th. So good chance to make that statement. I will say that I went to a couple of their in-person engagement sessions, and they were great discussions with lots of different people, but the format tends to water down what gets said because it's a small group breakouts and reports back and so on. So it's worth thinking about making sure that the strong statements get repeated. Well, I think we're probably we're well past the end of our time. Thanks to our panelists for sticking around with us, and thanks to all of you folks who joined us tonight and stuck around. We will continue. The group of us here who are on tonight have been pursuing this closely, and will continue to do that. And so we welcome any, if you want to contact us through Rob Kidd, who probably contacted you with the URL for tonight's session. Please be in touch, and thanks for your support on this. It's been a quiet issue for a long time, and it is finally being heard. So we are, I don't know if hopeful is quite right, but we're doing better than we used to. So thanks, everybody. Any closing comments from our panelists? Okay. Well, thanks all.
Thank you, Steve.
Good night, all.